Hey guys, we're back. So last time we talked about ethical culture, why it's important, why culture matters, what role culture has to play in fostering ethical behavior at a business, and what a culture is. It's a set of shared values, beliefs, and practices that guide behavior among members of some group. And Trevino and Nelson introduced this distinction between the formal systems that make up a business's ethical culture and the informal systems. So, the formal systems are those features of a business's ethical culture which are sort of in writing or sort of part of the structure of the organization. Things like official communication from the executive leadership, things like the rules that are on the books, or the um, basic structure of the organization, who has what jobs, how is compensation determined, those sorts of things. Okay. Um, but equally important are what they call the informal systems. So the features of the culture of a business, which are sort of not on the books, not fully explicit. They're sort of passed down informally, passed down sort of by people modeling their behavior for one another, or through word of mouth, or through something other than the kind of official channels of communication. Okay, so let's look at the informal systems that they distinguish and what role they might have to play in shaping moral behavior at a workplace. Okay, so we could talk about role models, norms, rituals, myths and stories, and language. So let's take those one by one. So the role models at a firm could be all sorts of people. They could be people who awarded some employee of the month type thing. They could just be management. They could be working employees, not especially senior not employees who aren't in management, but who have some seniority, who have been there for a little while. They could be people who are either formally or informally put into kind of mentoring roles for new hires. They could be the founders of the business who might not even be alive there anymore, or might not be around anymore. Okay, so um, when you have these role models, you want to ask what got them to that role model status. Are we promoting them as role models, or are they being held up as role models for their moral qualities, say for their reputation for honesty or kindness or cooperativeness or compassion or service to customers or suppliers or something like that? Or are they held up as role models because of their sort of strictly bottom line oriented features? Are they efficient? Are they ruthless? Are they shark like? Have they just brought in a bunch of money to the firm? Something like that. Okay, so if you're going to hold up some people as role models, one way to encourage moral behavior is to try to promote role models on the basis of their moral character. So, maybe somebody's held up as a role model, yeah, because they're especially friendly, or they're especially easy to work with, or they're especially patient with difficult customers or something like that. Okay. So, um, one thing to think about here is that there's a popular norm, at least in the United States, but I think in most of the world, against kind of being immodest, or as they say, virtue signaling about your own moral character. So people don't want to be caught touting themselves as like moral exemplars, as people that other people should copy for their moral characteristics. That you don't want to be caught virtue signaling. That is to say, acting in such a way that you sort of broadcast to the people around you that you're a virtuous person. Now, there might be good reasons why we have these norms. There might be good reasons why we sometimes find immodest or virtue signaling people to be obnoxious. But but you have to take these norms with a grain of salt, right? If you don't publicize some people's moral qualities or some people's virtuous behavior, you can't hold them up as a moral exemplar. I think we talked about this at least in one of the classes at one point. A lot of charitable donations are given anonymously, and maybe you think, well, isn't that nice because this person's being so modest? You know, they don't want to be seen as simply giving to charity for the purposes of benefiting their own reputation. But then again, you know, if all of the people who give to charity in your community are anonymous, you don't have anybody around you to look up to. You don't have anybody around you to say, oh, you know, that's the person that I want to be like, or, you know, that person is sort of setting the standard that we all need to follow. Okay. I think the case of Enron, business that was, at least at the time, but maybe still, the largest corporate bankruptcy in the history of the United States, is remarkable here. So the people at the top were held up as role models. So and they were sort of known for their ruthlessness and their cunning and their sort of belief in a kind of cult of genius where sort of like, you know, success is a matter of one person having a really good idea and then just like capitalizing on that one idea as best as they possibly can. Success isn't a matter of cooperating with other people. Success isn't a matter of sharing your ideas with other people or anything like that. And, you know, also these guys were sort of pretty hard partying, you know. So they would, you know, if you look up to the, you know, ruthless, hard partying people who regard themselves as geniuses and look down on cooperation with others, then, you know, that's the sort of tone that you're going to set at a firm. Okay, so if you're going to set up role models, think about all of the ways that you have of setting up people as role models. It doesn't just have to be upper management. It can be, you know, working people. It can be lower level employees who've been there for a while or something like that. And think about how you can select role models for their moral qualities and not just for their, you know, ability to make money for the firm. So let's turn to norms. So norms are what is actually, a norm is sort of what's actually expected of people, rather than what is the rule on the books, okay? So it could be that, you know, in Trevino and Nelson's example, that you have a restaurant that has this rule on the books about employees not eating in the kitchen, or employees not eating the food made by the restaurant, you know, at some fast food restaurant or something. And then you show up on your first day of work and you see everybody eating in the kitchen, and you see everybody eating the food that comes out of the, that, you know, comes out of the production line or whatever, comes out of the make line. And you say, oh, well, I see that this is a rule here, but like it's not the norm. It's the rule that's on paper, but it's not something that we're supposed to have taken seriously. There's a story in a psychology book that I was reading a while ago about the way that traffic laws, this person argued at the time, this was a long time ago, but the way that traffic laws worked in Mexico City. They said, you know, kind of nobody really follows the laws about red lights. You know, people run red lights constantly. The only purpose of the laws, so the laws don't match up with the norms. People are constantly violating the laws. The only purpose of the norm is just to find out who to blame when there's a traffic accident, when somebody runs a red light. And sort of like, you know, you probably don't want rules like that. You don't want rules which are just sort of there to point fingers after the fact rather than to prevent bad behavior in the first place. Okay. Something to think about is that whatever the rules are, they should be rules that you can enforce or that can be made to align with the norms. So if a rule is routinely violated, that sends the message that the rules shouldn't be taken seriously. So you could imagine a firm where there's on the books a very strict gift-giving policy that says, well, you know, you can never give gifts to managers can, or employees can never give gifts to managers, or you can never accept gifts from suppliers, or something like that. And then you see, well, you know, actually, it's really hard when a supplier comes and gives you something to say no. So it's actually we actually can't we can't enforce this rule. We can't develop a norm um, of actually following this rule. So that would be a big red flag for you, right? So you'd say we need to rewrite the rule so it becomes enforceable. It becomes something that can be made to align with the norms. I think a lot of firms' sort of office romance policies are like this. So you might have a blanket, this varies from one workplace to another, but you might have a kind of a blanket ban on any romantic relationships between any two people in an office. And then you say, yeah, but like given the types of people that we're hiring or whatever, we're hiring a lot of young single people or something like that. It's just bound to happen that there are going to be office romantic relationships. So when you're thinking about making rules for a company, one thing that you want to consider is whether it's actually in your power to cultivate a norm of following that rule. Okay. Um, let's turn to rituals. So, rituals are sort of repeated events that maybe they happen on some kind of cycle. Maybe they're given some sort of ceremonial or symbolic significance. Maybe there's some sort of um, symbolic sort of procedure that you go through in order to sort of carry out this event. Okay, so rituals can take all sorts of forms. So you could have a yearly picnic. You could have a, take your kid to work day. You could have awards ceremonies. You could have just office parties. Okay, so if you're setting up these rituals, you might want to ask, what are these rituals about? Are they about team building? Are they about the company's values? So Toribino and Nelson give the example of GM's like annual company picnic, which sort of encouraged each person to, through their slogan, "I am GM." I mean, frankly, it sounds a little cheesy to me, but maybe it worked for them. Their slogan, "I am GM," was sort of designed to encourage each employee to sort of think of themselves as responsible for the behavior of the company and sort of the public face of the company, and to adopt the values of the company and to sort of internalize the values of the company. Um, you know, it's maybe morally questionable whether employees should be made to be the public face of a company because that affects their private behavior as well. But at the very least, you might hope that employees could internalize the values that that the company wants to promote, at least at the workplace. Okay, so um, uh, that's an example of a ritual which is really about promoting the moral values which are supposed to govern the work at GM. You might alternatively just have rituals which are strictly about profit, So, and it's not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that. Maybe you, whenever a contract of a certain size is brought into a firm, you have a little pizza party or crack open a bottle of champagne or have some little celebration for the person or team which is responsible for bringing in this contract. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. You can praise people for bringing work into a firm, but you want to ask yourself: are all of the rituals strictly about profit? Are all of the rituals strictly about bringing new contracts in, about bringing new business in? Okay, so one thing you also want to think about with these rituals is not just what do they celebrate, what do they mark, what are they used to promote, but also how inclusive are they? So do they exclude people with children? Do they exclude people without children? Do they exclude older people or younger people? Do they exclude women? Do they exclude disabled people? Do they exclude people who weren't born into money? People who don't drink? Is there a lot of office ritual drinking at this office or drug use? Okay. So, you want to ask yourself if diversity is a value at the firm, or at the very least, you don't want to discriminate against members of certain groups at a firm, you want to make sure that these rituals are sort of open to or available to um, all of the people at the firm. So, one at this point, I think rightly notorious example of a kind of really, really non-inclusive ritual can be company golf outings. So, especially it's sort of white collar type jobs. You might have uh, uh, some sort of ritual which involves management or people who've had some success recently going out to a golf outing with the manager. But a lot of golf clubs, well, golf, first of all, is a sport which is played not exclusively, but in for the most part by people who come from money, by people who were raised rich. So, are you signaling when you take people out for a game of golf that, this is the type of environment that, is you should be comfortable in if you're going to be successful in this company? That is to say, if you're going to be successful here, you to really fit in, you have to have been raised rich. Or a lot of golf clubs are single sex. They're it's no girls allowed at the golf clubs, right? No women at the golf club. And so then, obviously there's a very clear, explicit way in which people are being excluded from this. Or there might be people with physical disabilities which prevent them from participating in these rituals. Okay, so golf is, I think, a really good example of a ritual that could look nice on its face. I mean, yeah, right. Like, isn't it nice that your boss is, takes some especially highly valued employees out on a golf outing, once a year or something like that. But then you say, oh, wait a second, what kind of message is this sending? Who's being excluded from these rituals? Okay, so if you're going to have rituals, and you kind of inevitably will, because rituals can take all sorts of forms, ask whether these rituals are at least some of the time sort of celebrating or promoting or symbolically related to the moral values which you want to govern the firm, and ask yourself how inclusive these rituals are. Okay. Trevino and Nelson mentioned myths or stories. So there might be a kind of myth about the founding of a firm. This guy was a little baby genius, and he tinkered by himself in his little garage, and he made a new widget, and then he started Widget Corp, and he made a lot of money or something like that. Or it could be a myth that has to do with trying to help people. Is it that this guy was just a sort of weird loner genius inventor, or was this somebody who was who had some personal connection to people who had sort of suffered in some way, and he wanted to start this business to alleviate their suffering or to contribute some good to the world. Trevino and Nelson give the example of Medtronic, which in this sort of yearly ritual invite people to, so this is both ritual involving and storytelling involving. So at this sort of yearly event, they'll invite people who have benefited from the medical technology that's manufactured by Medtronic. And so it's sort of like reminding people that the kind of point of the company is to help people, that, it's people over profit, or it's, that really the value that's being cultivated here is a value of helpfulness and of serving others and trying to make the world a better place. Okay. Alternatively, we could go back to Enron again. You might have myths at a company about just sort of like crazy parties that, somebody had in upper management. I have known people who've worked at firms that would have been like this, where it's like, wow, there's the annual crazy drug binge that you go on with your that upper management goes on, and you can go on it too if you get to be a certain level in this firm. And it's like, well, what sort of behaviors, maybe we'll hire some prostitutes or whatever for this crazy night out at the firm. Okay, so what when you're telling stories about um, uh, uh, sort of extraordinary events that might take place at the firm, what are you communicating about what the values of the firm are? This was the case at Enron, that there would be these stories passed around of these sort of legendary trips involving some upper management, and doing uh, kind of daredevilish, crazy stuff. I can't remember whether they were drinking or doing drugs, but at least they were like riding ATVs and sort of bruising themselves in various ways, and sort of like um, these are myths which promoted. These are stories which promoted a kind of recklessness, and in a certain way of understanding the story of Enron's downfall, I mean, what caused their downfall was recklessness. Okay. Okay. Lastly, Trevino and Nelson talk about language. So, what sorts of words or um, phrases do you hear over and over again at a firm? How do people talk? Um, so you might have a firm where there are sort of, some values, some core values, which are sort of referred to over and over and over again, some values statement which people come back to again and again. And so you're constantly sort of talking uh, uh, in a moral vocabulary about the workplace. On the other hand, you might have a firm where things are sort of success is at the firm, or sort of success in any transaction is described strictly in um, financial terms. Okay. Um, you might sort of have a general practice that when people are asked to justify some decision or some choice, they're asked to justify it they're sort of expected to justify it in strictly financial terms, or they might be expected to justify it in terms of, in some sort of moral terms, in terms of helping people, in terms of improving the world, making the world a better place. Okay. Um, um, I think it's also worth thinking about um, uh, the level of formality or informality that's expected in a firm. So you might have a firm that um, uh, really expect people in sort of internal communication to, dot all their I's and cross all their T's, and speak, the Queen's English, speak some very highly formal variety of English or something like that. You can ask yourself, who's excluded by having those sorts of linguistic standards? What does that do to a relationship when you expect that everybody communicate in highly formal ways? Not to say that this is necessarily a bad thing. So you might have maybe in some cases, communicating in very formal ways could kind of dignify a person, give them, show them that you respect them. Dear Madam so and so, dear Sir whoever. That confers some sort of respect. On the other hand, you might have a kind of norm of speaking informally with one another. Um, so that might help promote a kind of uh, friendliness or warmth, and a kind of fellow feeling or something like that, a sense that you're all in this together, or that or perhaps especially if everybody is sort of informal with everybody else, it might promote the sense that everybody's equal with everybody else. That it's not that you have to, maybe you could have some firms where the boss gets to speak in more informal terms, goes around swearing and uh, uh, just sort of speaking in vernacular English, but everybody else is expected to speak to their higher ups in some formal terms. So you can ask yourself, how are values of team building, values of respect, values of equality, um, uh, values of sort of fellow feeling or friendliness built into the language that's expected at a firm, and how are values of domination or authority or deference or sort of being kind of cowed or overawed by people in positions of power. How could those sorts of values be spread or replicated through the language that people use and are expected to use within the firm? How can this is perhaps especially true if the sort of formal language is sort of highly specialized and requires people who have a certain sort of education or a certain sort of background to participate. Who's going to be excluded, who's going to be included. Okay. That's it. This is a relatively short one. If you have not already signed up for a meeting time with me, so we can meet to discuss on Zoom, meet to discuss your ethical culture project and your case study, please do so as soon as possible. I hope you're all staying safe. Hope you're all healthy, holding up all right. Okay. Thanks again. Until next time.